Good afternoon, and welcome to Definitive's first episode of Amplified Chat. We plan to bring together experts from the industry as well as experts from our floor and discuss our shared passion, knowledge, and just pure enjoyment for music in this industry. I'm Kevin Wolfe. I've been in the industry for a long time and have had the privilege of working with Definitive as a manufacturer for most of that time, and recently feel super proud to have been able to join their esteemed team. I'm excited to bring this to you live today, this chat, or the first in this series chat. If you have any questions, please drop them into the bottom chat button that you'll see on the screen. We will do everything we can as time permits to address any questions you have, either in real time or at the end. And with that, let's jump into what you guys came here for, and that is to chat with one of our most important vendors. Definitive Audio started in 1975, and of the group of first vendors we worked with, and one we continue to work with today, is Bowers Wilkins. From the UK, we brought in one of my favorite people from within that company. His name is Andy Kerr. Andy is Director of Product Marketing and Communications, and he's staying up a little extra late for us tonight since it's early afternoon here in the Pacific Northwest. So thank you, Andy, for joining us. Andy is also a good friend on a personal note and is behind some of the music that you'll hear us play, both when we demonstrate on the floor, but just, again, personally, some of the music he's turned me on to. He's one of the biggest music lovers I know. Check out on our website, we've got a series of different playlists, and Andy may not know this, but on those playlists, he will find nuggets that he gave us. Oh, so really? With that, Andy, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for having me. I love music lover. I think music addict would probably be the fairer description to kind of speak to me about how I talk about this stuff. But yeah, no, that's great. And again, thank you so much for having me on this inaugural event. I greatly appreciate it. It's very important for us to, to support you guys. We have a lot of respect in our relationship with you guys. So I appreciate very much being asked to be involved tonight.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Andy, I know this sounds cliche, but the first question I want to ask, and I always find it interesting to hear everyone's personal story, and while I may know a little bit of how you got started in the industry, I don't think the majority of people that are sitting in today have. So how did you get involved in our interesting industry and fun industry?
Wow. Okay. So, this is a great interview with Paul McCartney where he says he couldn't imagine a moment in life where he didn't have a song playing in his head, like from the day he was young. And I'm seriously nowhere near as talented as that great man, but I have that same thing. I think I kind of, from age 4 or 5, was just, there was always a tune. There was always something going on. If there was a beat somewhere in the house, I was finding it and I was bopping along and I was finding that music everywhere. So I was kind of pooling money with my friends, like 8, 9, to buying singles, which is probably pretty early to be buying singles. Bearing in mind the time I was doing that, which is in the 70s. So I was buying like punk records and stuff. I mean, if my mum had known the stuff that I was playing, that might have not gone so well, but there it is. So by the time I was like 11, 12, I already had like a good record collection of pretty good records. I'm very proud of some of my first records. I can stand up on those. I'm kind of, they paint me out as somebody who knows this stuff, hopefully. So anyway, age 12, very fortunately, unfortunately for the relative concern, but fortunately for me, I acquired inheritance because a relative passed away. And I bought my first hi-fi system. And again, I imagine that's very unusual for age 12, but I had a record collection, so I wanted it, right? So I bought a pair of speakers. I'd love to be able to lie and tell you they were Bowers Wilkins speakers, but I'm afraid that wasn't true. Or wouldn't be true, pardon me. They were Mission. But I did buy a Rotel amplifier, so there you go. And I had a turntable, a decent turntable too. I bought a Lin. So that was me for 5, 6 years, pretty much. Any weekend job I could get, any time I could buy records or buy some improvements on my hi-fi, I was just hooked. I was in record stores. I started working in a local retailer, a hi-fi retailer, as a Saturday job, and then that kind of turned into things. So I kind of worked all the way up to the point when I was, a graduate, then looking for my first job. So 21, 22. What do you do when you've now got, obviously, a kind of direction in life predefined for you? So I got involved at that time in being an editor for a magazine. So I was working in the UK for UK journalist titles, a publication called Hi-Fi, you might know it.
Yep.
So I was there for a period, and that was, again, great. I mean, literally that first day when you turn up at that place and they kind of open the door to the storeroom and kind of go, aha, and then you're looking at like your fantasy kind of world of like every amplifier brand you can think of and every speaker brand you can think of. So I had like a really good education curve then. I mean, I thought I knew the stuff, but basically I was just taking something home every week, every day, trying out new things, spending time, learning a bunch, learning a ton of stuff, going on every trip, talking to every industry person I could, trying to kind of just seep all this knowledge in. And then that was kind of always with the intent that somewhere along the line I wanted to get involved actually with the engineering side. And that opportunity came up eventually, thankfully, through Bowers and Wilkins. In fact, they tried to recruit me twice, and for various goofy reasons, best known to my own stupid teenage self, well, I wasn't teenage, but 20-something self, I kind of went, I'm not quite ready. But third time around, they came back third time. So I thought, I've got to say yes now. So yeah, I've been with them ever since. So it's basically, I literally just turned 50, as you know, last week, and the beard kind of gives it away. But this is basically my entire life. My life is music. I love with a passion. Films, I must admit, I also completely love. And then the stuff that helps it come to life, which is hi-fi and recording studios and everything around that.
Well, that makes you perfect at Bowers and Wilkins with their super long history dating back to John Bowers and the 60s, a little bit before we started.
Yeah.
You're rolling past the 50-year mark. Bowers and Wilkins is. We just rolled past 45. So we, as both of our companies, actually grew up very much together. Give us a little bit of that a thumbnail of that history. I've heard many stories, and every time we chat, I learn a new John story.
Yeah, he's John Bowers is one of those people, I guess. I mean, in the US, it's kind of more a commonplace thing, like a really driven self-starter kind of person. In the UK, perhaps not so much, but he served his country. He served in the military during the war. Mm-hmm. In fact, he was in a department or organization within the army that dealt with radio, the Royal Corps of Signals. And from there, he was recruited into British military intelligence. He actually genuinely did, no BS, serve in MI6 Section 8 to be precise. So if you're not familiar with MI6, I'm sure you're familiar with James Bond, same thing. So he wasn't an overseas-based spy. He was dealing with intercepting German radio traffic. Which is obviously perfect for somebody who worked in the Royal Corps of Signals. So his job was based out of a place called Wadden Hall in the UK, kind of related to Bletchley Park. Some of you may have heard of that. And their job was to listen to what the Germans were doing and kind of understand it. So he kind of had a real deep understanding of radio, clearly. After the war, he and the guy he'd met whilst in the service there, which is Roy Wilkins, basically said, what do we do? And I think the measure of John and the measure of the kind of person he would then become is how quickly everything moved, right? So the war in Europe ended in May. By November of 45, they'd applied to form a company. By August of the following year, they'd started their first small shop, the Bowers Wilkins shop. This is kind of not hanging around. We need to get stuff done. We need to get stuff done. And he's that kind of go-getter, right? So while he's working in the shop during the day, he then put himself through night school in the evenings, getting qualified as an acoustic engineer because he knew about electronics, but he didn't necessarily know about loudspeaker design. And the other thing I think that's really important about him is he was kind of like me and like so many people like you that are in this industry. He was passionate about music. He regularly, really regularly attended live music, particularly classical. So the thing that kind of inspired him to take that step from being a guy who worked in a store selling radio equipment to a guy that basically built loudspeakers full time is just essentially frustration. It's a desire to try and do it better and a desire to try and make speakers better than the ones that he was able to sell himself. So he basically started experimenting on the designs of loudspeakers that he was selling through the storefront, putting in new values, changing capacitors, changing transducers, whatever it might be. And it became a sideline business that eventually mushroomed into a full-size business. I think it's a real self-made man kind of story is the summary of it. And I think the other thing that really defines him, Kevin, is basically once he got that, he didn't stop. Do you know what I mean? It wasn't like, oh, I'm now there. He everything thereafter throughout his working life, right up to the moment when he sadly died, was 100 miles an hour and 110 miles an hour if you could manage it, you know. So they work 6 days. They put in hours and great stories, like when they're chasing deadlines on product development, and John wanted the whole team to stay behind, and people would work because they loved him, but he'd go get his car and he'd park it across the entrance to the car park. Boss doesn't leave, so you don't leave. It's that kind of stuff, you know. He's just like obsessed, absolutely obsessed with doing better. And I think a lot of that DNA kind of still runs through us to this day.
Well, I think we talked about this the last time you and I got together, dating back to the late 80s, the application of computer-aided design. Behind me on the screen is a small little speaker that had a minor impact on the industry. There are parts of the famed Nautilus that's now 27 or 28 years old. And it's still in production, and it's still setting the standards from an in-ceiling product that uses technology derived directly from it. And through today, he's not with us anymore, of course, so you have a different design team today, but how does that live on? I know I've been in the anechoic chamber that John worked in, and now you have a new facility as well.
I think that the first and important thing to understand is that there's no such thing as a perfect loudspeaker, right? So I think if you adopt that philosophy, which is something that he said right at the start, then you never kind of rest on your laurels. You never kind of sit there and go, right, my work is done. So everything's incremental. You can always improve. You can always do better. And you look at every single element each and every single time and reassess. Mazda, the Japanese car brand, has a tremendous philosophy called the Gram strategy, where they talk at, it's very difficult to take a huge amount of weight out of a car, and sometimes very complex too, but you can take a whole bunch of small elements of weight out of a car, and cumulatively it matches up to the same thing. So in the loudspeaker sense, it's the same. So elements that you ultimately know will work and will get you to where you need to get to are always still reassessed. I'm talking about things that you might think, nah, but like tags on terminals, or spikes, or I don't know, the spider, you know, anything that, you know, functionally is pretty proven, and visually, as far as the customer is concerned, probably doesn't contribute a whole hill of beans to the look and the feel of the product, but it still can make a difference to the overall performance. That's how we think. So what I love about it is, if you have that philosophy in mind, sometimes you can come up with frankly quite ridiculous changes, things that kind of have everybody in the whole room going, what? A perfect example was, genuinely, we changed the terminal tags on the CM series, from CM series 1 to series 2, and literally it's like this much metal, and it was a perfectly good electrical conductor before, but just going to a different material, which is nickel, just massively improved things, and that's great. I mean, what we then find is, okay, fine, if we've achieved that, why, how? I think the other thing that's probably driven through the Bowers Wilkins DNA, I'm not saying this is not the same for other brands, far from it, but certainly within us, is if we find something by accident, we then want to understand why it worked, so that we can do it again, or that we can re-engineer it into other applications. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. One of the things that fascinated me, since you're sitting in front of an 800 D3, is the ring that holds in each of the woofers and throughout the 800 series, and how just the shape, while they're circular on the outside, the portion you can't see, it acts as a clamp, but it has specific shaping to reduce the sound, and how big a difference that makes. And that's not something you can see.
No, well, listen, I mean, ultimately, you don't have to understand how good the gearbox is in your car to appreciate driving it, right? I mean, I don't think everybody needs to be fully conversant in the engineering process to appreciate that something kind of feels better, or looks better, or just generally rides and drives better if it's a car. In a loudspeaker, there's a lot of things going on internally. Not every one of those has to be pulled out and celebrated and shown to kind of actually, you know, contribute and make the difference. I mean, in our case, the other thing we love, I suppose you'd call it, is like free benefits. What I mean by that is, you're going to have to take a tool, a metal cutting tool in this case, and you're going to have to machine a piece of metal to create an aperture to put a drive unit. I mean, it's an extrusion. It's, as you can imagine, it's a singular extrusion, and we're cutting it like that, and then we're finishing it on the inside to create a nice smooth surface finish. And that's just going to happen anyway. So it's not a great deal of a hill of beans on top of that to then go, well, what happens if we just machine a kind of eccentric pattern inside rather than a perfectly smooth circle? Doesn't really add a ton of cost, doesn't add any material cost, makes a difference. That's perfect. I love that kind of stuff.
Well, as do I. That's why I brought that one up, because I that one was fascinating to me to see that. And I think one of the most compelling features, I believe, of Bowers and Wilkins products is that consistency. Whether it is that 800 D3 I just described the ring on that is different than an 805 D3 ring, or a ceiling product, or the famed AM1 outdoor product, a wonderful Eve product. And then, of course, the 4 car manufacturers you work with, or headphones and I understand headphones in particular have some challenges to carry that consistency through.
Everything has its challenges, right? I mean, I think if you talked about like what is the perfect acoustic system or mechanical system, then obviously if you can do things like use weight and use exotic materials, then things become a bunch easier. I'm not saying any of it's simple, but it becomes a bunch easier. Fundamentally, mass has some advantages. A high quality material like aluminium has has some stiffness to
it. That's okay. Our customers are sophisticated enough to understand aluminium.
But that has some benefits to it as well. But you see, not all of those materials or processes port or translate to other applications. The most obvious, to your exact point, being headphones. I mean, right there behind me, that's an 803. So that's 11 kilograms of aluminium, again, multiple pounds. And that's great. I'm just talking about the head assembly, by the way. That's great. It's beautiful in terms of its performance, and it gives us a ton of advantages because the specific modulus is so good. So it's really, really stiff. But if you want to put that on your head, that would be a bit of a problem. So we have to try and approach each use case, each application case, in a way that makes sense for that particular environment. I mean, again, think of a car. You can't use really heavy metal components sitting on the dash top of a Maserati or a McLaren or a Volvo, because in the event of a crash, then you've essentially got a small metal missile kind of flying around the inside of the car. And crash test people naturally would take some kind of offense by that. So we have to think laterally and come up with different ways of executing. But it's great because it's interesting, it's challenging. I think one of the most compelling products that we do in lots and lots of ways is also one of the most affordable products that we do, which is the 600 series range of loudspeakers, and in particular the real entry level model, the 607, because from a dollar value point of view, I would say this clearly because I've worked on it, but I don't think there are many better value loudspeakers out there. But it pairs back on everything in terms of aesthetic, in terms of design detail. I mean, you can buy speakers at that price point, as I'm sure you know, that will give you like a real wood veneer or give you a high gloss finish or something else like that. But the bits that make it good, at least in my opinion, are really solid engineering driven principles behind the transducers. The drive units are fundamentally very closely related to what you get in one of those. And that's great. And that's, again, an interesting set of challenges for us as engineers to sort of deal with. How do we take those choices and still come up with something that you guys want to sell and that customers want to buy, that we think is the right price point, the right product, and the right combination of all of those attributes of design, finish, but most fundamentally of all, sound quality.
Touching on that consistency, so 3 years ago, if I have my years correct, the CI800 series went to CI800Ds, which pulls the diamond technology from the 800 series. Last year, you released the new CI700s, which pulls Continuum, which also came from the 800 series, and the 700 box product S2s. Yeah. That technology, I understand that there are both challenges with CI or custom integration product, but I also understand there are some advantages, namely using a large 8.1, for example, or 8.3, I'm sorry. You know where it's going. It's going in the wall. It's got an infinite baffle. And so it seems to be some great opportunity.
Yeah, nail on the head. The infinite baffle is a really important point, man. Really important. I mean, I think you can understand exactly, as you said quite rightly, the acoustic volume. You understand exactly what's happening around the boundary, because the wall is the wall is the wall. So you're kind of working on that principle. And yeah, I mean, you can completely optimize the system. I think it's To be fair, it's also very typically the case that in installed loudspeakers, they're often used with external woofers or integrated woofers as well. So again, some of those challenges are a bit different from our perspective. We're not always, I mean, 8.3 is somewhat different, but we're not always trying to make a full range loudspeaker. So it's great. I mean, this and what you're sitting behind as well, but what they both do is that they serve as essentially like our technology innovation hotbeds. So all of the new resource and engineering, all of the kind of breakthrough stuff is poured into them, in particular into this guy right behind me. So kind of no holds barred, like how much can we push? What can we come up with next? What crazy ideas can we explore? And we explore some crazy ideas, believe me. But you have to try, right? And sometimes they come off and sometimes they don't. What is important to understand is once we've achieved that, the next set is essentially trying to roll that technology and value engineer that technology into as many other applicable use cases as you can. So to your exact point, I mean, CI 800 series Diamond essentially has the same drive units as that. And CI 700 now has the same drive units as the 700 series. And it's great from a bunch of reasons. It's not just from the point of view of, frankly, making our lives easier, but what it also means is the consumer now has so much more flexibility. Let's say you wanted a theatre system. You could, if you so chose, only have a pair of 800s or 700s at the front and have every other speaker in that whole system installed, creating a very slick, very elegant looking system. But it's super cohesive because they've all got the same transducer. They've all got that same tonality. They've all got that same character. So that sound field, that multi-channel sound field still really works. It just happens to be the case that only 2 of the speakers are on show and the others are integrated. That's, for a lot of people, I think, a very compelling use case.
Awesome. You own your own factories, right? So you have the UK factory and one factory in Asia, which gives you tremendous control from start to finish. And if I remember correctly, even down to the continuum cones, those come out of the UK. So you truly are a first tier manufacturer, meaning raw materials. The way I like to describe it is, raw materials, aluminium comes in one door, and out the back door comes a finished product. That's got to offer some extra challenges.
I think what we discovered a long time ago, and JB used to speak about this as well, as I said to you earlier on, is everything makes a difference, right down to manufacturing process, right? Mm-hmm. You can have things outsourced, but there are a bunch of reasons why it introduces risk that you don't necessarily want to have to deal with, both in terms of production viability, stability, and also things like quality control. What it also means is you've got a really full understanding about how the whole system behaves. I mean, one of the reasons we develop our own transducers and then manufacture our own transducers is partially about literally preserving our intellectual property. If somebody else made our driving units, they've got the chance to copy it, right? But it's also about being able to be sure, as an engineering and development team, that we fully understand the behavior of each cone. If you think about how that applies outwards, think about a crossover in a loudspeaker, in a passive loudspeaker. We're not having to manufacture filters to cope with somebody else's problems. If there are issues within the driving unit, we understand them because we develop them. So we can really get that very cohesive knit between each element of the system and make it kind of, as far as is possible, a seamless kind of single drive unit listening experience, because all the way through all of those elements of the chain, we manufacture. I mean, an interesting thing, with in terms of manufacturing process, of course, as well, is we've been able to kind of help connect the customer with how we build. We're very proud of showing off what we do. I mean, you obviously know because you've seen it for yourself, and a lot of people do come to our factory, and we're very proud to show it all off, and we kind of take people around and kind of go, this is what we do here, and this is what we do here, and this is what we do here, and this is why we do it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually been quite an interesting sales tool over the years for a lot of people, because some people naturally kind of look at the ticket price and some of these things and go, oh, that's too much. I can't afford that. Or I couldn't begin to justify that. And I tell you, the number of times I've taken people around on a factory tour and they come out afterwards and going, wow, these are cheap. They're actually too cheap. They're cheaper than I expected them to be. You've just, you've spent like 21 days making one of these, that's a real value.
Well, and actually, just to make a quick plug for you, there's a great video on YouTube of that speaker behind you being fabricated from start to finish, which I found fascinating the first time I saw that. A lot of fun. We talked a lot about consistency of products, and there's one aspect that we haven't touched on that I find also quite fascinating, and that is the recording industry.
Mhm.
A couple studios, if I remember correctly, it's a couple hundred studios
Yeah.
in the world are using Bowers and Wilkins. Anybody that knows me knows I'm a bit of a Peter Gabriel fan, so Real World Music's at the top of my list. I know that's one of them. There's a small studio. You mentioned Paul McCartney earlier. Certainly added a little bit to the lore. Can you talk a little bit about that relationship with Abbey Road and how that filters? I mean, the consistency taking a recording that was made in Abbey Road,
Mhm.
playing it in my listening room at home, and then jumping in the car. That just to me is a phenomenal, simple story.
So look, right in the early days of the company, John hired a guy who was on the board of directors at EMI, so Dennis Ward.
Mhm.
And that's sort of why a lot of the products in our early stages had the word monitor in their name, even though we were making, at the time, consumer-only product. Things like DM70, domestic monitor, which when you think about it, is quite an unusual way of describing a home house loudspeaker.
Mhm.
It all related to that kind of connection right from the get-go with the recording industry and what's involved in the recording industry. So in 1980, Dennis and Steve Rowe and John went up to Abbey Road Studios with the then very new 801, which had just been developed, and got the guys to try a pair out. And they wouldn't let them leave with the speakers in the car. They had to kind of leave them there. So it kind of went from there really. So we've been involved ever since. I mean, we have, as I'm sure you know, multiple pairs in various different locations around the space. So we've got generations of speakers as well. There are one or two studios where, for various different reasons, the guys don't want to give them up. And what I find with engineers in studios is great. It's like, to some extent, it's like us. They treat speakers like a tool. I mean, they love them, don't get me wrong, but they treat them like a tool. So until the tool's broken, they don't want to change it.
Sure.
So you go in the control room in Studio 1 and in Studio 3. Studio 1 is the very large space where all the orchestral work is done. Studio 3 is a space where a lot of rock in particular is done. Also, by the way, you'd be interested in this. This is where the mix downs for a lot of Floyd stuff was done. And they use 800D3. They use the new ones. In the Studio 2, which is probably the most famous studio in the world, where the Beatles used to do all their stuff, they still use 801s. They have Nautilus 801s. In fact, they have diamond equipped ones. But yeah, it's, by the way, I just have to say, it's just the most fun experience in the world when you go there. In that control room, which is really not a big room, I'm not joking, it's a control room. We have 3 801s as near field monitors. And I've had them do live play. I'd say it's like being beaten up. It's just, it's insane. It's like, this isn't sound, this is physical.
Well, that's what David Bowie told us on Ziggy Stardust.
Yeah.
Play at maximum volume.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they like that.
The command.
But I think what I found really fascinating over the years, in fact, you might have seen some of the stuff we've been talking about very recently, is how speakers like 800s have almost become cultural, as well as being loudspeakers. They've become kind of like part of the cultural fabric. They have been present at the creation of a lot of some of the most important recordings that you and I, and probably most people attending this right now, have watched or listened to over the course of the past 30 years. If you've seen Raiders of the Lost Ark, if you've seen Return of the Jedi, if you've seen, going all the way to the day 1917, it was done in Abbey Road on 800 series loudspeakers. If you listen to a lot of the most important pieces of music, as I say, that we could reel off, done in Abbey Road on 800 series loudspeakers. So it's awesome. From our perspective, it's great having that that direct connection. Now, you asked how it translates to the consumer. What it means is, when we're working right at the very, very early stages with development, we're talking in a two-way dialogue with some of our dear friends in some of those recording studios. So we're talking to guys like Andrew Dubman, who he did like the sound for Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, and he can give me direct feedback on how things sound if I ask nicely. He's a mate. But that's great. That's awesome. That's, again, how to kind of build our real understanding of what people have an expectation of from the sound. And they're great because they're engineers, so they're brutally honest, and brutally honest is good. When you're trying to move quickly, let's not pussyfoot around here, guys. Just give it to us unvarnished. That's what we like. And that means in turn, we can then kind of try and incorporate that in. So what we then try to do, if you like, is preserve the essence of that music loving experience in the end, in the tuning process on the loudspeaker. And I think this is the other real important thing here. If you wanted to define Bowers and Wilkins sound, it's probably 60% measurement, research, process, technology, using the world's most advanced materials, all those things are the things we like to think. But a ton of it is personal. A ton of it's human. It's guys listening to music in a listening room, tuning. And if you don't know music and can't connect with music, and you can't connect with how music was first created, then you're not going to do that as well. So that's, again, really important from our own cultural values. We have that strong symbiosis with the origin point of music, the recording studio, and that means the output of music, which is the loudspeaker or the headphone or the car or whatever it might be, we can really connect with too.
So I understand we had a slight hiccup on the start live, so I didn't get this out to everybody that's attending. So if you do have questions, please drop questions down in the chat box and we will try to get to them. I do have one based on something we talked about earlier about the Bowers and Wilkins DNA and the process of building a better product. We always like those stories. This isn't supposed to be a gotcha. This is actually supposed to be sort of fun. Do you have a story about something you found accidentally in the process of design?
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I mean, there was a perfect example with the current generation of 800 series, right? So we were attempting to, if we could, transform every transducer. You know, we essentially couldn't do anything about the diamond dome, so we worked on every other part of it, literally the motor system, the assembly, all the rest of it, but the actual dome is the dome. Continuum was obviously a very big story. From the low frequency point of view, we were actually working on a very different material type as a principle, as an idea, because it worked great. And in theory, it worked great. It modeled superbly. And we, went to the point where we actually put it in the room, put it in the loudspeaker. Everybody attended, and all the guys like, "Wow, this is going to be great. This is going to be awesome." And we pressed play, and everybody kind of went, "Oh," and it was just like, "Well, that sucks." And that was just, it's what I'm trying to say by that is exactly that point almost that I was just proving that sometimes these things you have to listen, you have to try, you have to go through that process, because sometimes they model great, they look fantastic. In theory, it's the perfect solution. Boom. So we thought, well, what do we do now? Because we still want to come up with something new. So somebody said, well, look at the existing cone that we currently use, that we precedingly used, and what can we do? How can we try and play around with it? And we tried different processes of the form, if you remember ROSL, and came up with the curve. And again, the curve, if you remember in the original design, Kevin, it was right down at the bottom. It was down by the voice core. And we tried that, and because that again seemed logical. Where does it move the most? Down at the voice core. So where does it need to be stiffest? Down at the voice core. And that didn't work either. And that was equally confusing, because that really was like the right place to put it. So it was one of those sort of situations where you're just looking around at different ideas, and somebody one day was idly looking out the window and sort of saw a plane, and kind of and we came up with what happens if you put it in the middle, which is like a wing, and that's where the aerofoil idea comes in. So I'm not going to say that's how things work all the time, because it's clearly not. But I think sometimes sources of inspiration coming in from different directions are not necessarily always what you would expect. And I think the most important point about this of all is no great invention sprang into life the first time.
Sure.
You have to keep inventing, and eventually you'll invent something.
Perfect. Well said. So I have another question. I've tried to incorporate a couple of the questions that have come across as we've gone. This one just came across asking about the challenges of working with auto manufacturers and what auto manufacturers you work with, because obviously the mobile environment, the car, limited space, different materials, and attitudes.
Now, you know what? Okay, let's talk about the good things first, right? If you were to buy a pair of those loudspeakers, I would have no idea about the size of room. I mean, you would, Kevin, but I wouldn't have any idea about the size of room that you were going to put them in, or what cables you were going to connect them up with, or what kind of amplifier or DAC or anything else, what your front end unit would be. I'd no idea how tall you are, how far away you're going to sit from the loudspeaker, any of those things. In a car, we have a whole bunch of data. So we know what the construction properties of the acoustics of the cabin are going to be. We know the distance relationships between you and the transducer, because somebody's going to be sitting in each seat, and unless it's a certain kind of car, it's pretty sure somebody's going to be driving. So we can understand all of that stuff. We can go, well, there's X feet to here from here, and the driving is at this site or this site. So we've got a ton of benefits. And of course, the amp is the amp, can't change it. The cables are the cables, can't change it. It doesn't necessarily mean it's as good as, like, you know, the most exotic amps, but it does mean that we have that complete and holistic kind of understanding of the whole system, and we can optimize as a result. You'd also go, well, okay, depending on the car, there are some noise, vibration and harshness issues that, you know, obviously you clearly got to deal with, most obviously in something like a McLaren, which is fairly noisy. But countering all of that, the same, at least it's a constant, you know, and again, we can understand it, which we can't necessarily understand in your home space. So from the point of view of some benefits, there are a lot. From the point of view of challenges, now you asked about challenges, the obvious ones. You think about where loudspeakers want to go in a car door, right? Most of the time they want to go as high as is possible. Why? Because I'm sitting in the seat and my ears are up here. I go in most cars, particularly 80s cars, and the drive units were right down by your knees. Right. And that was just because that was the easy place to put them. But I haven't got ears in my knees. So I need these things to come up. So what we're trying to do is trying to get the drive units as high as we possibly can around the kind of horizon point of where your ears are. But then look at a modern car door. And what modern car doors do is they're kind of pretty wide, lower down. And as they come up, they get narrower and narrower and narrower and narrower to the point where they meet the glazing. But that narrow point is exactly the bit where we want to put the speaker. So yeah, that's a challenging set of conversations to be had, which is why oftentimes what you see now is we actually don't even put it in the top of the door. We actually go into the area above it, what's called the mirror sail, which is the area behind the mirror.
Right.
Which is great because it's a separate space. Because this is the other thing in a car. There's a ton of stuff behind a car door. You've got the AC ducting, the central locking, the crash safety intrusion protection. You've got obviously airbags in a lot of vehicles these days. And all of that stuff, and the electric window lifter and all that stuff, it's all fighting for spaces that we're also trying to deal with. So it's a long and ongoing conversation. The great thing I think I can say is a positive about all the automotive guys that we deal with is all of them have come to understand over the course of the past 5 years the added value that we can bring. Sure. And I think, I mean, you've heard me say this a bunch of times, Kevin, so sorry, but if you said to somebody in all seriousness 15 years ago, you had a $5,000 car audio system, they'd probably form a certain impression of you, right? And they kind of imagine you're the kind of guy who drives around in a car that has that woofer that you can hear from 3 blocks away, and maybe has like a big spoiler and kind of flames and neon strips and stuff. And, you know, that's what it was. But it's not anymore. It's become a credible thing, and it's become a credible value add to a lot of premium cars, to the extent that we're continuing to grow and we're continuing to add more cars all the time.
So today, what are the manufacturers you're working with?
So Maserati, BMW, McLaren, Volvo, and Polestar. So we're in 26 cars right now across that portfolio of vehicles. And as I say, growing rapidly.
Outstanding, outstanding. We have to wrap up shortly. I would like to ask a quick question that just came across, and you touched on it just loosely, so maybe just a quick response to the difficulty of redesigning a product, and when you decide that it's time. You know, how do you approach that?
You have 2 things running all the time. You have development track and research track. So development track is cyclical and linked to the need to refresh a product. So we wouldn't probably want to leave anything out there in the market for too long. There is one exception, and it's that one behind you. But most of the time, things are typically somewhere between 3 and 5 years. At the same time, running independent of that is research. Research is not anchored to any particular timeline. If it takes you 9 months to come up with a result, you come up with a result in 9 months. So that's finding new transducers or finding new material properties or finding new ways of thinking about things. What we tend to prefer to do is only think about changing something when we've genuinely got something meaningful to say or something meaningful to add. So we're not particularly into just midlife cycle refreshes just for the sake of it. Ideally, if a new model comes out, it's because there's at least one significant change in terms of performance, transducer change, or some other technical improvement in terms of the design. So obviously, always cognizant of what else is happening out there in the industry. And personally and professionally, I think we've got a lot of respect for, some of the big players, some of the good brands. So we obviously keep our eye on them. But our number one target all the time is, can we do better than what we do already? So we spend a ton of time almost immediately the minute we launch a product. I mean, it's almost like a killjoy experience in some senses. We've launched it, it's out there. Right now, let's go find out what we did wrong. Kind of look at all the issues, go under the scene, be really forensic. Again, as we've got measurement tools these days that allow us to sort of really get under the skin of a product and really identify those issues. So we've done that work, and then it's a case of now, well, let's try and find a sensible timeline to kind of, fix the problems if we've got any, and come up with something better next time around, which is obviously what we're always trying to do.
Awesome. Well, on that, or with that thought, do you have, as we wrap up, any teasers for what might be coming soon?
Oh,
Don't
God.
worry, it's not being recorded. Nobody's listening.
Nobody. Okay, so
It's
listen,
just
guys.
you and me.
Nobody's. We're always working on the next generation. Let's be clear. I think you'd be disappointed if I sat here today and said, "Hey, this is the last generation of 800 we're ever going to make." There's a new. We're working on the next generation. Of course, we are. We have to. I'm not going to be, giving you a timeline on that, because that would be unfair. But we're certainly in the works on that, and on a whole bunch of other stuff related to that, because that's the right thing to do. Any brand that didn't would be irresponsible. I think just as interestingly, is a lot of knowledge being developed on active. I think we obviously had some very interesting breakthroughs with formation, and that in turn has kind of helped us really understand a lot more than we already thought we knew about the performance of active and about the performance potential of active. So what other things can we try and take from that into perhaps higher end products, or perhaps into other applications around active? I think that's kind of a very interesting area. But the most significant thing is obviously the one sitting behind me, and that'll be the one that will continue to probably dominate the majority of our time for the next couple of years.
Sure. So I have one last question that's squeezed in. They got in under the radar, or under the timeline from Facebook. So thank you. This is about room acoustics.
Okay.
And the question is, why do you believe there's a timeline maybe that this would come? I'm going to add that to the question. There isn't a pre-scan for tonal qualities of a room to help better choose a loudspeaker, the appropriate one for that room.
Do you know what? I'm going to reverse that question out and put it the other way. I think there should be. I think it's the most important single contributing factor to the acoustic performance of a system, beyond the fundamental parameters of the transducers and whatever else they might be. So I've seen over the years so many people come up with outlandish claims for how they can improve audio systems by, I don't know, I'm not going to name, cables is the one that always gets a bullet, and I happen to be a fan, but I think people talk about stands and stuff, and some of these things do make a difference. Whether they make an improvement is a separate thing. But you know what? An hour with a tape measure and some marker tape on the floor and putting the speakers in just the right place properly will transform your system without any question. And I think the same thing applies to the room and the room acoustics as well. So, I mean, if I had a perfect world solution to every room and every room acoustics, that would be a much more challenging thing to deal with. But to my mind, I almost think from your perspective, Kevin, I presume it is the case. Every question that you have in any sales conversation has to be beginning with, well, where are you going to put these speakers?
That's right.
What are you going to connect them up to? What's the room going to actually be like? I've seen so many amazing, beautiful looking rooms that must sound truly terrible because, there's like a pair of $30,000 loudspeakers standing in front of like 10-foot tall glazed window running across the whole thing. It's like, yeah, that won't sound very good at all. So yeah, the room acoustics is fascinating, hugely important, and I'd urge everybody who's in any conversation about their product to have that conversation with their retailer. I think it's 100% one of the most important undiscovered areas. From our personal perspective, as Bowers Wilkins, with passive systems, it's not so easy to deal with. We have to kind of have that conversation with you guys. With active systems, as some of you might know, it's something we're really interested in. We have it in the DB series of active subwoofers, and very much something we want to expand upon going forward.
Awesome. Well, with that, we've kind of hit that time mark. So I cannot thank you enough for staying up late for us and arriving in the Pacific Northwest. Hopefully the next time we can actually physically have you here. We're about to hit the perfect time of year where our seafood is the best on the planet. So it will be worth the trip, I assure you. As this is a wrap, I want to, for those of you that weren't able to join right at the beginning, I want to let you know that we are or have recorded this whole episode. So it will be up on our website as quickly as possible and our YouTube channel. So feel free to drop in over the next couple of days, and that's at definitive.com. Quite easy, or we'll have a link when it is live. We'll announce that on Facebook. And so with that, until next time, thank you everybody for joining us. Andy, again, thank you so much for staying up late for us and helping us know a bit more about Bowers and Wilkins.
My pleasure, my friend. See you soon, I hope.